Hi and welcome back to my channel. So for the last video, February, I have chosen a pretty well-known case that left everyone in just pure shock as the nice and perfect couple next door turned out to be pure evil monsters, responsible for a lot of agony and terror. The trigger warnings for today's case are sexual assault, domestic violence, alcohol and drug abuse, as well as murder. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video. Paul Bernardo was born on 27th of August in 1964 in Scarborough in Canada to his parents Kenneth and Marilyn Bernardo. Paul's mom was put up for adoption by her own parents, so she and her siblings grew up at an orphanage where Marilyn was adopted by a wealthy couple by the names of Gerald and Elizabeth Eastman. It is said that Marilyn lived a happy life growing up in the upper class. She is also described as an extroverted and kind teenager. Her adoptive parents were always there for her, and in general were just kind-hearted people. Now, Paul's father, Kenneth, he had Italian roots and managed to build and run a marble and tile business. Kenneth grew up with three brothers who were all older than him, and he also grew up in the upper class. Now, his father would drink rather heavily, and when drunk he would take all of his frustrations out on his wife and his sons. The family was kind of old school, but more in a way of the wife and children should be seen but not heard until spoken to. Kenneth later on decided to become an accountant rather than joining his father's business. As for Marilyn, she at first wanted to marry, I believe it was her first boyfriend, who she was really in love with. But her father was against it, so he kind of pushed his daughter in the direction of Kenneth Bernardo. So the couple got married in the 1960s. They moved right in the upper middle class neighborhood in Scarborough in Toronto. They had a very nice house which had a swimming pool, and soon into the marriage, Marilyn and Kenneth will soon welcome two more children called David and Deborah to the world. But their marriage wasn't really made out of love. Marilyn didn't really want to marry Kenneth and only agreed to because her father wanted her to. And Kenneth was very well aware of that fact, and he unfortunately followed in his father's footsteps, and he became very abusive towards Marilyn and his kids. As for Marilyn, she put up with it, but eventually she found love with a previous boyfriend who she actually wanted to get married to. And from this reconciling, it's when on the 27th of August in 1964, Paul Bernardo was born. Once Paul was born, he had a purple mark on his face, and this reminded his mother of something called devil mark. But it said that the mark was just a blood clot and it basically disappeared on its own within just a few months. Marilyn describes her son to be the easiest out of her children, and that Paul was a very quiet and kind of introverted kid, and that he also wasn't very fond of showing any type of affection. He is also described as a very stubborn child, and Paul was also very self-conscious of the way he spoke, because during his birth he was actually deprived of oxygen for quite some time and actually needed to get surgery to kind of rebuild his ability to speak properly. Paul was also bullied quite badly by the other kids at school, where they would give him the nickname Smelly Barnyard. And his life at home wasn't the most stable either. Kenneth and Marilyn would get into very heated arguments, and they also stopped sharing the same bed. And when Paul was 7 years old, his mother Marilyn, remember she was adopted, Marilyn managed to get a hold of her sister, and so she started to spend a lot of time with her trying to catch up on lost time, which caused her to be gone from home quite a lot. Marilyn was using the fact that she had found her sister as a way to escape her loveless and also abusive marriage, but she also left her 3 children alone almost every weekend. This unfortunately became even worse when Paul was, I believe, about 5 years old. He actually ran away from home. Now, I have no idea where he went or what he was up to, but once he returned, no one even batted an eye over it. No one asked where this 5-year-old boy was or what had happened. The family acted as if they didn't even realize that Paul was actually gone. As Paul was growing up, he changed a lot. He was now described as a friendly and happy young boy, man, who always liked to show off his dimples. Paul had 3 very close friends named Van, Alex and Steve, and they would spend a lot of time with each other. They went to the same school and also were Boy Scouts. They shared a lot of the same interests, and once the boys grew older, they still kept the same interests, and you'll understand what I mean by that shortly. In 1981, Paul was around 17 years old. He had met a girl called Nadine Burmer who was 15 years old, and he was really interested in her, so the two of them started a relationship, and I believe this is also the first time where Paul was sexually engaging. They dated for about a year, but Nadine broke up with him and actually started to date one of his best friends, Steve. And if that's not bad enough, I mean, your girlfriend breaking up with you and dating your best friend nonetheless, surely must have sucked for him. But 1 year prior to that, when Paul was, I believe, 16 years old, his mother actually came clean to him and told him that Kenneth isn't his biological father. He saw a picture, and according to him, he said that it was like looking into a mirror. And the confession almost broke the relationship between him and his mother completely. He couldn't cope with the fact that he had been lied to for 16 years, and from that point on, he would start to insult his mother and in general be very emotionally abusive towards her. Paul at this point also started referring to himself as the bastard child from hell. And things just kept getting worse and worse because Kenneth had actually started to sexually abuse his 9-year-old daughter Deborah. He would assault his daughter in the living room whilst the whole family was sitting there watching a movie. Poor Deborah would always shut her curtains in her room, and her father, and I really can't believe I'm about to say this, climbed on the rooftop to watch his daughter getting dressed, and she became so scared that when bedtime came around, she would put garbage cans that she filled with coins around her room. So that she knew when Kenneth would sneak into her room, she would use a flashlight to get him to get away. And her mother Marilyn was very well aware of the fact what her husband was doing. But for some reason she never confronted him about it, and this just ate up at her. She became extremely depressed, and Marilyn gained a lot of weight, and she just stopped caring for the house, her family, and also herself. She would basically lock herself in the basement and hide food under her bed, trying desperately to just isolate herself from the truth that happened right in front of her. And this family dynamic just sent Paul spiraling out of control. He burned everything that reminded him of his first relationship, and once he graduated from high school when he was 17, he started hanging around bars and coming up with different stories to get random girls to have sex with him. Paul had gotten a job at Amway, which is an MLM, and also went on to go to the University of Toronto with the goal to become an accountant. And he didn't move out of home, but his parents did split up for a short time. Marilyn moved out and had gotten herself a 1-bedroom apartment, but Kenneth would still come and visit her every weekend. Paul also started to talk to his friend Van about a fantasy of his, which she called a virgin farm, where there would be multiple virgins just waiting to sleep with him. And his relationships would all kind of develop a pattern. At first, Paul was very charming and caring, but soon he would tell those girls what his expectations were, and also that he wanted the girls to participate in rough sex with him, which involved Paul hurting the girls for his pleasure. And once the relationship came to an end, Paul would also threaten his former girlfriends that if they dared to say anything what he did to them, that he would kill them. Once Paul had turned 22, he had gotten into a relationship with a girl called Jennifer, who was 16 at the time. And the relationship was pretty abusive, to say the least. Jennifer wanted to study psychology, and Paul told her that it would fit her perfectly since she was already so messed up in her head. There was also an incident at a Halloween party where Jennifer dressed up as a harem girl, but with all the guys around. She told Paul that she was cold and she didn't want to take her coat off. This angered Paul so much so that he actually ripped the coat off of her and threw cold water all over her. And once Jennifer screamed out, he actually hit her. So Paul basically took the pattern of his father into his adult life. And Paul wasn't all that faithful to Jennifer either. In 1986, Paul met a woman called Lenore, who was a little older than Paul. Well, not really older, I think she was his age, but definitely older than the girls that Paul would usually date. And he took a liking to her. He would take her to nice dinners, so like always it started off nice. He was a gentleman, but shortly afterwards, Paul told Lenore that he would need to punish her because she wasn't a virgin. He took Lenore to a quiet spot where he proceeded to spank her with his belt, and Lenore had to apologize because she had sex with someone before Paul. One night, Lenore wanted to surprise Paul, so she went over and saw girls' shoes at his door. And once she entered, she went to his door in complete rage. But Paul refused to answer, so Lenore actually punched her way through that door, and that's when she saw that Paul was in bed with Jennifer. So that's how both of the girls found out about each other, and they were immediately done with Paul. And Paul really took a similar turn as Kenneth, because at 57 years of age, Kenneth was put to court on the 8th of February in 1984 because he was facing accusations of molesting a young girl. So this dysfunctional family really took a turn on Paul because he was now looking through the windows of his neighbors. Ex-girlfriends of Paul would also later come forward and say that Paul would take them to these deserted buildings, parking lots, and he would force these girls to do a lot of depraved acts. He liked to choke these girls, but not like a little breath play here and there, but he would actually use a cord and also force the girls to have anal sex with him. After his graduation from college, Paul got a job as a junior executive at Prince Waterhouse Cooper. But even with this amazing job, Paul continued his criminal side business where he would smuggle cigarettes from Canada to America. In the summer of 1986, Paul was in two different relationships with Carol and Susie, but apparently two girlfriends weren't enough for him because he would still go out and have multiple affairs. Eventually, though, the two girls found out about one another. But because Paul was such a manipulator, neither one of the girls actually left him. Around that summer, Paul received two restraining orders. One from Carol because Paul kept making very obscene phone calls to her. In 1987, Paul was still in a relationship with Jennifer. And at some point, Jennifer told him that she was going to the police. And I guess that was kind of a deal breaker for him because after that he had just stopped dating in general. He just started to attack girls because he realized that it was way less risky to live out his fantasies with a woman who had no idea who he was. And so that's how the Scarborough rapist was born. The first reported attack was in May of 1987. A 20-year-old woman was getting off the bus when Paul went ahead and brutally attacked her as well as assaulted her in front of her house. In the same month, Paul followed a 19-year-old woman off the bus where he proceeded to attack her in the backyard of her parents' house. And this attack lasted for over an hour. In July of 1987, Paul tried to attack another woman, but she actually managed to fight back, and this made actually Paul run away. In September of 1987, Paul broke into a house where a 15-year-old lived. He climbed into her bed with her, put a hand over her mouth and threatened her with his knife. Thankfully though, the mother of the girl came into her room, and when she saw Paul, she started to scream, which actually made Paul run away. Another man was actually accused, arrested and also convicted of the crimes that Paul Bernardo committed. In October of 1987, Paul met his soon wife-to-be and also partner in crime, a woman called Karla Homolka. Karla Lee Ann Homolka was born on the 4th of May in 1970 in St. Catharines, Ontario. Her father, Karl Homolka, was actually born in the former Czechoslovakia and moved with his parents to Canada when he was about 7 years old. Karla's mother, Dorothy, was a hotel administrator until she became a mother, and from this point forward, she was just a stay-at-home mom. Karla had also two more sisters called Laurie and the youngest sister Tammy. Karla was suffering from asthma and therefore would spend a lot of time in hospital. And according to her mother, Karla was developing faster than average. While she was in 3rd grade, Karla scored a 131 on her IQ test. Her teachers liked her very much because she was an eager student and she was always giving 110%. But this also came from her desire to be perfect. Karla is described as a girly girl and would put a lot of meanings on her looks. And her friends would describe her as very bossy from a young age on. Once Karla turned 12 years old, she developed a huge interest in true crime and mystery. She wanted to become a detective, and Karla also started to go to the extremes just to scare her friends, where she would invite them to interact or play with a Ouija board, if you will. And Karla just kept on developing these negative features, where she once wrote in a yearbook, "Bones rule, death rules, death kicks, I love death, and kill the effing world." At 13, she changed her appearance completely. She started to wear only black, cut her hair short, dyed it into different colors, and also started to wear heavy makeup. Her friends also noticed that she had started to self-harm, but Karla also started to experiment with alcohol, drugs and sex. Her first boyfriend was a boy called Doug, and he said that it was the fact that Karla was so different that attracted him to her, and that she was considered as one of the prettiest girls at school. Karla also formed a Mean Girls group with her three best friends Kathy Wilson, Debbie Purdy and Lisa Stanton, calling themselves EDC, which standard for Exclusive Diamond Club. And this group shared the same goal: find a rich, successful older husband. As for Karla's father, he managed to get himself the nickname the pervert because Dorothy, Karla's mom, was working at the Shaver Medical Clinic, and one of her co-workers was going through a divorce when one night Karl was just standing at the door telling her how much he loved her and that he would leave his wife Dorothy for this woman. This woman was dumbfounded and told him like, "Listen, but it's not gonna happen." So she sent him away and called Dorothy and basically told her everything. And Dorothy actually went over there and said, "Look, he is not in love with you, but could you do me a favor and engage in a threesome with us?" So Karla's upbringing also wasn't really the healthiest. Karla was also obsessed with animals, not in a good way though. She once made a parachute and tied a hamster to it. Later on, she would actually dig up that hamster because she was curious about the decomposition part. She even started to work at a local pet store when she was 17 years old. She went with some of her co-workers to a pet store convention in Scarborough. The first night there, Karla and her friend Debbie went out drinking, and once they returned to the hotel, the girls got dressed into the PJs and decided to go down to the hotel restaurant to eat something. So the girls are just sitting there and eating when they are approached by two men. It is said that Paul was immediately hooked to Karla the moment he had laid eyes on her, and as for Karla, she was always fascinated by Ken from Barbie. And Paul just reminded her so much of Ken that she was also immediately smitten by him. He was handsome, charming, and he was also 7 years older than her. Paul had this bad boy personality going on, and after the girls finished with their food, all of them went up to the hotel room where Paul asked her for her name and number, which actually surprised his friend, because Paul never really asked for names or numbers from girls he was looking to have a one-night stand with. So Paul and Karla fall in love with each other almost instantly, and Paul also came clean almost straight away about his fantasies. I'm not sure though if he told her about his sexual assaults, but he told her everything about his kinks and fetishes, and Karla wasn't shocked by it. She was more excited by learning about this side of Paul and even encouraged it. Karla had told all of her family and friends about this handsome older man that she was so completely in love with, and her parents actually liked him from the first time that they met him. He was very charming and protective over Karla and called her his little princess. He was generally caring for the whole family, including the youngest sister Tammy, who was 12 years old at the time. She really adored Paul. The first official date actually was after Paul has met Karla's family. The two went to the movies, and later Karla threw a party when the couple snuck away and Paul handcuffed her to the bed for the first time. Paul would come over to Karla's house almost every weekend, and because he was so charming, the couple would eventually get the permission that Paul could spend the night at their house. But the parents did have a condition, and that was that Paul had to sleep on the couch. But of course the rule was quickly broken, and Paul would sneak into Karla's room when everyone else was already asleep to have sex with her. Karla would later say that Paul had trouble getting into it, unless it involved him in complete control and hurting his partners. One night Karla saw Paul watching her sister Tammy through her window, and I guess this was close to when Karla actually confessed to Paul that she had lied to him and that she wasn't a virgin. Approximately 6 weeks of them dating, Paul would strike once again when he stalked a 15-year-old girl who got off the bus. This attack would last for over than an hour, and it happened right in front of the house of this girl. On the 16th of December in 1987, the newspapers first referred to him as the Scarborough rapist, which I guess only pushed his ego up even more. The whole area was just living in fear as the girls weren't allowed to go out by themselves. And there was even a task force formed to investigate. But there were so many anonymous tips, and they were all looked into, which made it even harder to actually find the responsible person. There was even a criminal profile made by the FBI on what the offender may look like. Paul and Karla spent their first Christmas together, and as their present she received a dress out of gold, which was worth about $300. and a very nice necklace. As for Paul, he received a coupon from Karla which said Karla Lee and Homolka will perform sick, perverted acts for Paul Bernardo. On the 18th of April in 1988, Paul had found himself his fifth victim, a 19-year-old college student. She tried to get away, but Paul punched her a few times and then dragged her to a quieter location where he assaulted her. But soon Paul realized that the police were actually on to him, so he stopped his attacks in Scarborough and just moved locations. And he didn't really take a break either, as he would strike once again on the 13th of May, when he attacked an 18-year-old girl in Mississauga. And because this attack wasn't in Scarborough, no one really thought to connect these attacks. Paul and Karla's relationship soon started to escalate, as Paul would become so controlling that she had to wear whatever he told her to wear, how to do her hair, what to say, how to act. He would call her degrading names and expected Karla to also call herself by those names. In March of 1988, Lisa, one of Karla's friends, found what looked like kind of a checklist where Karla wrote things like eating healthy, exercising, but she also wrote kind of a rule list regarding her relationship with Paul, where she wrote, "Don't talk back to Paul. If he asks for a drink, just bring him one quickly and happily. Remember, you are stupid, fat and ugly." In December of 1988, Paul kind of declared to Karla, since she lied to him about being a virgin, she now would owe him something equally. And Paul was really into anal sex and requested that from Karla, which she refused. She just wasn't into it. And he was mad at her for 2 months for denying him. In February, Paul took Karla to his parents' house, while his parents were away on vacation. And at this house, Paul has set up a camera and he instructed Karla on what exactly she should do while he took pictures of her. The couple were almost together for a full year, and up until this point, Karla went along with everything that Paul wanted from her, until he asked her to wear a dog collar, and Karla just laughed at this request, which made Paul so angry that he slapped her across the face. And in the end, she would put the dog collar on, and Paul even attached a leash to her. So now Paul has started to become physically abusive towards his girlfriend, but Karla still wrote him a letter for their anniversary where she thanked him for the best year of her life. And not only is he abusing his girlfriend, but Paul would strike once again on the 4th of October in 1988. This time though, the girl managed to fight back, and Paul, so angry that this girl was defending herself, stabbed her multiple times in the lower body area. This girl was rushed to the ER where she received stitches for her wounds. 1 month later, he attacked an 18-year-old girl in the backyard of her own home, and on top of his abuse and assaults, he started to date another woman called Anna, who lived in Toronto. And of course, Paul didn't tell Karla anything about this new woman. Karla graduated from high school in spring 1989, and she had planned to go to the University of Toronto. She was interested to study criminology, but those plans were made before Paul, because he told her, "Look, if you wanna be my wife, you can't go into a job that is so highly dangerous." And for Karla, she just accepted it and went on to work as a vet assistant. The couple had actually planned to move to Toronto, but because Paul had also committed attacks there, he didn't really have Toronto in mind. And on top of it, Paul was just looking forward to quit his job. He liked living a criminal lifestyle, and he also liked the side businesses he created by bringing things over the border. So yeah, Karla had now graduated, and at her graduation party, Paul drank way too much, and he started to accuse random boys, men, mainly the football players, of flirting with his girl. It escalated to a physical fight where Paul ended up getting, well, I don't know if a broken, but definitely a bloody nose. The whole summer of 1988, Paul had been driving every weekend for roughly 2 hours just to see Karla. And at first, her friends really admired that Paul was so into her. And also her friends, whenever they went out, Paul would buy them drinks for all of her friends, but soon these girls realized that every time they received drinks from Paul, the drink just looked off, so eventually the friends stopped taking drinks from him. Also during that summer, Karla told her parents that she would go with Paul to visit his grandparents, when in reality Paul took Karla to Florida, where the couple spent 10 days in Disney World. Both Paul and Karla loved recording themselves, so Paul took a camera with him and basically recorded them having sex with each other. Paul also assaulted a 22-year-old woman in the same summer of 1989, and he also assaulted a 15-year-old girl in November in 1989. Around the same time in November, Karla was being accused by her boss of stealing ketamine from the vet clinic where she worked. Ketamine is a medication to induce loss of consciousness, kind of as an anesthetic. And in December in 1989, Karla quit her job and started to work at the Martindale Animal Clinic, where she worked as a vet technician, meaning more responsibilities and also free access to the medication. Paul had also quit his job in December and took Karla to a romantic getaway to the Niagara Falls. And on the 9th of December, he actually asked Karla to marry him. As they got back home, Paul would strike once again on the 22nd of December, when he attacked a 19-year-old girl in an underground parking garage. And this girl said that she had a feeling that her attacker wasn't alone. She felt like there had been maybe a woman, and this said woman looked like she was holding a camera in her hand. On the 4th of January, Paul started his new job as an accountant, and he was earning a nice salary on top of it. Paul and Karla had already set the date for their wedding, but that time Paul was still living with his parents, and his anger and hate towards them grew more and more each day. Just 2 months into his new job, Paul decided to call it quits because he just stopped showing up for work. He just went ahead and continued his side business where he brought cigarettes from America to Canada. And he made a lot of money. On the 4th of May, Karla turned 20 years old, and she wrote to her friend Debbie telling her how great things were with Paul and just how happy she was, and if this friend was interested to be Karla's bridesmaid. As the wedding planning was going on, Paul, in the meantime, had gotten himself into $25,000 worth of debt, and he was forced to file for bankruptcy on the 23rd of May. Well, he did have money to get out of his debt, mind you, but he preferred to keep his money that he legally earned. On the 29th of May in 1989, a newspaper article was published with a reward of $50,000 for anyone who had any information on the serial rapist, because Paul had attacked girls as he was on his way back home from visiting Karla. And somewhere along this attack, the girl managed to see his face, and she also had a photographic memory and was able to describe Paul to every detail. So the investigation is going on, and even more tips are coming in. In the meantime though, Paul is sitting at Karla's house casually at the pool when they run out of beverages. So Paul says like, alright, no problem, let me go grab some from across the border. And Karla's youngest sister Tammy, who did kind of have a school crush on Paul, decided she just wanted to join him. Now, what I should mention is that Karla was very well aware that her sister liked Paul. And in fact, Paul had told Karla that he had fantasies about Tammy. But again, it was nothing bad in Karla's eyes. and she even had sex with Paul in Tammy's bed, pretending to be her little sister. This even went as far as the couple drugged Tammy, and once she was out, Karla was watching the door as Paul was revealing himself next to Tammy's face. So Paul and Tammy went ahead and drove off, and they didn't return until after midnight. And for some reason, Karla wasn't concerned in the least. She wasn't concerned, but she was very angry. Not that Paul was away for so long with her underage sister, but because she felt like her relationship was in danger. In her head, if Paul wanted her sister, because he had previously mentioned since Karla had lied to him about being a virgin, he now wanted Tammy for it. And for Karla, it was more of wanting to be involved. She didn't want a boyfriend to go behind her back. So she and Paul actually started to plan on how Paul could have his way with Tammy. Karla knew that Valium wouldn't do the trick this time. They even played with the thought of sleeping pills, but quickly realized that it would also not do the trick. Now, Karla still worked at the vet clinic, so one day she just took a book with her, and that's when she came across a drug called Halcyon. And Karla was familiar with this particular drug since her mother used it in the past and it knocked her out. Once she had found the ideal drug, she placed an order at the clinic since she was responsible for stocking up. So now she had the medication, and while planning all of this, Karla thought to herself that this whole thing would actually be a perfect Christmas gift to Paul. And just to make sure that her sister wouldn't wake up during Paul's assault on Tammy, Karla also purchased a drug called halophane. On the 8th of December, Karla was pretty much at home alone with Tammy, since her parents were out for the whole weekend celebrating their wedding anniversary. And as for Laurie, at first she wanted to go out, but something changed her mind, and so she decided to just stay home with her sisters. As for Paul, he almost developed a complete obsession over Tammy, which made Karla furious. She just wanted for Paul to get it over with so they could focus on their upcoming wedding. So now on Christmas Eve in 1990, Karla's family was celebrating, and Paul, of course, was also there. His gift for Karla was a brand new Sony video camera which he had purchased with her credit card, since he was in so much debt. So yeah, he got her this camera and he actually recorded the whole day. Karla's parents preparing everything, Karla, and of course also Tammy. Now, for all that I could figure out, the parents apparently didn't really have a big issue with their underage daughter drinking, at least as long as everyone was at home. I'm guessing the parents thought, if you want to drink, at least do it in front of us, so they could still kind of have an eye over it. So the family just sits around and Paul hands Tammy her drink, which the couple had already laced with halcyon. Shortly after, Tammy actually made a joke saying that Karla and Paul had poisoned her, and that was also recorded. But no one really said anything to that, and soon Tammy went up to her room to call a friend of her. Laurie actually scolded Paul and Karla to stop making drinks for Tammy and to stop getting her so drunk. As it got later and later, Laurie, as well as her parents, went to bed just as Tammy was coming back down, and that's when Tammy, Paul and Karla sat down to watch a movie together. So they watched the movie and eventually Tammy passes out on the couch, and as soon as Karla saw that, she got up and got the halcyon, while Paul in the meantime was setting up his camera. The halophane was poured on a rack and placed over Tammy's face as Paul started his assault on Tammy. Karla over time would pour more and more on the rack, and after a while Paul actually stopped and demanded Karla to join in. As they switched again, Tammy started to vomit, so the couple are now in full-on panic mode, quickly turned her around. Paul picked her up and carried her to Karla's bedroom, and the two tried to quickly dress her back up as they started to perform CPR on her. Tammy wasn't responding, so that's finally when Karla was like, alright, I'm calling 911. Meanwhile, her parents and Laurie didn't even realize what went on. They were actually only woken up by the sirens outside of their house. When the ambulance finally arrived, they rushed Tammy straight to the hospital with her parents, while in the meantime, Laurie, Karla and Paul were being questioned. When asked what happened, Karla just said that Tammy all of a sudden had just stopped breathing. Unfortunately, by this point the doctors weren't able to do anything for Tammy. So Tammy Homolka ended up losing her life only weeks before her 16th birthday. The officer that was still going through his questions received the call that Tammy had passed away, and Laurie completely broke down. She ran into her room, just bawling her eyes out. The officer actually went after Laurie, and once he came back down, he saw Karla throwing the blanket that was still covered in Tammy's vomit into the washing machine. He immediately rushed over to her, but the officer said that the blanket at this point was already so wet that any evidence was probably gone by now. Weird, but alright. Karla, Paul and Laurie were taken to the police station for further questioning. But Paul and Karla's story were pretty similar. Too similar as they were using the exact same words, making law enforcement already very suspicious of them. They also didn't really believe the story on how Tammy had gotten the burn on her face, because it was clear that the burn was caused by a chemical reaction, but nonetheless, Tammy's death was ruled as an accident. Another thing worth mentioning, a family friend later said that she never really saw the family grieve, like crying. In fact, once this friend came to the house of the Homolkas, she heard Karla and Paul having sex. And as for Karla, she was actually annoyed that her parents weren't giving her the attention, and actually didn't want Paul hanging around constantly at their house anymore. She even wrote to one of her friends where she complained about how much longer they could possibly be grieving. The parents also told the couple that the wedding should be way smaller and also invite way less people, otherwise they wouldn't pay for it. On the 12th of January, Karla and Paul again had the whole house for themselves, and to take advantage of it, the couple decided to go looking for yet another girl that Paul could assault. And they did soon find a girl that they only referred to as January Girl, because neither one of them actually knew what the name of this woman was. The assault was also recorded by Karla, and she had hoped that this would be enough for Paul, and that now that he had satisfied his desire, he would go back to focus on her. The whole situation escalated to the point where Karla would put Tammy's clothes on and pretended to be her dad's sister just to make Paul happy, because he was really struggling with the loss of Tammy. Karla and Paul also started to make plans to move in together, since her parents didn't really want him staying there anymore. And I personally think it's because the parents did suspect that he had something to do with the death of Tammy. The couple did find a place eventually, so now that they moved in together, Karla finally starts to feel like she had gained her power in her relationship back. Somewhere around in March, Karla suggested to Paul, since it was spring break, to take a van and go to Florida for 2 weeks, and that he could also take some other guys with him. Now, those other guys were maybe 16 or 17. Paul at this point was 26, so he picks up and drives to Florida. And at first everything was great. The boys picked up some girls here and there, but once they had arrived at Daytona Beach, a 24-year-old woman called Allison crossed Paul's path. He had engaged in sex with her, and she satisfied every need of his, which made Paul a little confused because he loved Karla, but now he thought that maybe he loves Allison too. So Paul actually lied to Allison and told her that his little sister Tammy passed away in his arms recently, and that he now lived with his older sister Karla. He even stayed in America a little longer and actually went on to meet the parents of Allison. And once he returned to his fiancée, he didn't lie to Karla. He told her everything, and I believe he also showed her some pictures. But despite all of it, Karla still stayed in the relationship. And after Paul's confession, it was a very tense atmosphere which made Karla even more aggressive. So she came up with something that she was sure no other woman would do for Paul. On the 6th of April in 1991, Paul had found himself yet another victim, a 14-year-old girl called Karina Jenkins. At 5 a.m., Karina left her house to go jogging when she got a weird feeling that someone was following her. As she looked around, she did indeed see a man behind her, but what just fell off her Karina was that this man was in his regular street clothes, so he wasn't there to jog. She picked up her piece to create more distance, and that's when a car slowly passed her. Inside, a blonde woman waving at her. Now, it was actually never confirmed if this woman was indeed Karla or not. And that moment, Karina was already grabbed from behind and dragged into the woods, where Paul proceeded to assault her. One day, Karla had met a 12-year-old girl called Jane, and Jane kind of looked like her dead sister Tammy. And by this time, Karla had realized that Paul needed other women to satisfy himself. So as far as Karla was concerned, she had just found her perfect wedding present for Paul and Jane. Once Jane was 15, she would always come to the pet shop when new puppies arrived. So she and Karla talked often, and one day Jane gets a call from Karla asking if she wanted to come over to her new home to see the new puppy that she had just gotten. So she went over to Karla, who also told her that Paul wasn't at home, and these girls watched movies, played with Karla's new dog, and also had a few drinks. Of course, the drinks were laced with halcyon, and once Jane was out of it, Karla called up Paul and told him to come home quickly, because there was a special surprise waiting for him. They assaulted Jane, and after Paul was done, he put her to bed. The next morning, Jane didn't remember anything, so Paul and Karla drove her back home. Finally, their plan had worked how they wanted it to, but Paul still wasn't happy. He kept on accusing Karla that she had killed her sister on purpose because, according to him, she knew how to drug someone the whole time. On the 14th of June in 1991, Paul picked up the marriage license for his wedding, which was already said to be a big celebration, as the couple had already invited over 150 people. He picked up Karla, and the two of them drove over the border for Paul to do his business. When they came back, a 14-year-old girl called Leslie Robinson caught their eye. She had just returned home from her friend's wake, and Leslie was over her curfew, so the doors were all locked. So she got on a payphone and called up her friend Amanda and quickly filled her in, asking if she could spend the night at her home. But since Amanda's little sister was sick, she just told Leslie that it wouldn't be the best solution and that she should just go back home and knock at the door, wake her parents up and take, whatever punishment they have for her. But Leslie never got back to her house, and once the parents of Leslie realized that she hasn't come home, they called the police to report the daughter as a runaway, when in reality Leslie was being held hostage by Paul Bernardo. Leslie had run into Paul on her way back home, and the two started to talk, and Paul offered her cigarettes which he claimed were in his car. And as soon as Leslie was inside the car, Paul pulled a knife from underneath his seat and instructed Leslie to pull her shirt over her head so that she couldn't see where he was driving her to. Once at home, Paul woke Karla up and told her the news that he had found another girl. But he also told her not to come downstairs, which of course she didn't listen to. So she snuck outside of the bedroom to the stairs, where she could see Leslie kneeling before Paul, and he was setting up his camera. Now, this didn't really seem to bother Karla, as she went back to bed, But once she woke up the next morning and saw two champagne glasses, which, side note, Karla had specifically ordered for their wedding, so they were brand new, unused, and this made her very angry and upset. Leslie was being held captive for about 2 days, and Paul recorded everything. Her using the bathroom, showering, and mind you, Leslie is still blindfolded the whole time. She was blindfolded since Paul had pulled the knife on her, and he assaulted her throughout the whole time, and Karla even joined in at one point. The bit is unclear, but somewhere on the second day of her imprisonment, Leslie Robinson ended up losing her life. If you want to believe Karla, it was that Paul had strangled her to death. If you want to believe Paul, it was an overdose on the drugs that they forced down on Leslie. The couple hid her body in the basement next to a sack of potatoes. And to make things even more worse, the next day was Father's Day, so Karla's parents were actually at their house having a casual dinner while there is a dead body in the basement. Once the parents left, the couple took a saw and cut up Leslie's body, put them into concrete and threw it in Lake Gibson. Paul and Karla got married on the 29th of June in 1991 at the Niagara-on-the-Lake. And as for the honeymoon, the couple went to Hawaii. In the meantime, Leslie's body was found at the lake, and the cement blocks were sent to the Hamilton General Hospital for an autopsy. Once Paul and Karla had returned home, they were informed about the finds that had been made, and this story was very big because St. Catherine's was a place considered to be very safe. But nonetheless, Karla stocked up on Halcyon as she invited Jane and her mom for dinner. Karla only invited her mother because once they had returned Jane home, she was sick for a few days, which made her mother suspicious. Like, you guys are mid-20, Jane is 15, what are you exactly doing? But this plan backfired on Karla as Paul kept on talking bad about his parents, which surely didn't make a good impression on Jane's mom. And what Jane's mom didn't know was that Jane had slowly started to grow into the life of Karla and Paul, where she would even join them in the bedroom. Well, she didn't go all the way, as she was actually feeling bad for Karla. So on the 10th of August, Jane was visiting Karla and Paul again, and this was the night where Karla decided to drug Jane. Even though she kinda liked her, she didn't like the fact that this girl would be willingly at their house, and she would also be willingly around Paul. So she kept giving Jane drinks, which of course were laced, and around 3:30 Jane was already out of it. But that's also when she stopped breathing. So Karla, now in full panic mode, rushed to call 911, and they went on to try to get Jane to regain consciousness. And she did start to breathe again, so Karla rushed back over to the phone to cancel 911. That night both Karla and Paul stayed awake to make sure something like Tammy wouldn't repeat itself. But they also knew that this couldn't go on because not only was Jane's mother suspicious, Jane had also mentioned to one of her teachers, I believe, that Paul had touched her, which this teacher of course told Jane's mom. Jane was spending Christmas with Karla and Paul. Paul gave her a gun to a shaggy dog, which told her was $300. He also gave Jane a golden necklace and a watch, but this time Jane didn't really want anything to do with him, because Paul by now had started to manipulate her. Since Karla was a good friend of Jane, Paul would say things like, if you don't do this and this, Karla will stop being your friend. And on top of that, Paul would constantly compare Jane with Tammy. And Paul had a lot of photos of Tammy all over the house. So one night, Jane had enough. She told Paul that she wasn't interested in him and that she didn't want to have sex with him, which upset him so much that he and Karla ignored Jane for the rest of the night. So Jane by this point thankfully was like, alright, screw you all. She called her mom to pick her up and never went back. On the 12th of April in 1992, the lead detective Irving of the Scarborough rapist case had 5 DNA samples that were a match. And under those 5 samples was also Paul Bernardo's DNA. On the 16th of April, Karla and Paul were on the look for yet another girl, since Karla had promised him that she would help him to get to 50 sex slaves. But again, Paul was demanding that all of these girls had to be virgins. So Karla came up with an idea, and the couple drove to Holy Cross and Lakeport high schools, where they found a 15-year-old girl called Kristen French. Kristen was a Girl Scout and was ascribed to love rowing and figure skating, and she was also volunteering at a nursing home. She had also a boyfriend called Elton, who gave her kind of a promise ring which she always wore on her left hand. At around 2:40 p.m., Kristen finished school, and she would need about 15 minutes until she got to her home, where she would wait until Elton would call her. At around 3:30 p.m., Elton called her, and Kristen's father actually picked up. He told Elton that she hadn't come home yet. So Elton was alright, no problem, I'm just gonna call later again. And around 4 p.m., Elton calls again, but Kristen still wasn't at home, which was weird because she was never late. In fact, she had her schedules that she rarely ever went off on it. So where was Kristen? Well, as she was walking home, she was approached by a young blonde woman who was standing by her car with a map in her hand at the Grace Lutheran Church. But as soon as she got to Karla, Paul immediately appeared and held a knife to her neck. They all got into the car and drove back to their house, where Kristen was sexually assaulted by both Paul and Karla, as the couple again recorded the whole thing. Paul eventually took a break and they all had dinner together, where Karla had small talk with Kristen before she was again taken upstairs by Paul. She tried to play along and do whatever Paul wanted, but eventually Kristen French would end up losing her life. Her body was found on the 13th of April in a ditch, pretty close actually to where Leslie was laid to rest. The investigations began, and there was even an eyewitness telling police officers how a girl got forced into a car, but this witness unfortunately didn't know which car it was. Officer Constable Kenny went over to question Paul, not really thinking that he did anything, but because his DNA sample was mentioned regarding this Scarborough rapist. So he went over there and asked Paul if he knew a girl called Kristen French, and Paul, as cool as ever, answered all the questions. He even invited the officer inside the house. The officer also asked him where he was on the 16th of April, to which Paul says that he was at home with his wife. And the next question was if either him or Karla ever owned or driven a Camaro, which this eyewitness said the brand of the car was. Paul denied it, saying he never owned nor driven a Camaro, as he owned a Nissan. So with that, the detectives just left. Once Karla had gotten home and heard about the visit, she kind of became paranoid, so the couple took all of their homemade videos and hid them in the ceiling. On the 15th of May, Karla and Paul legally changed their last name from Bernardo to Till, and while at it, Paul also changed his middle name from Kenneth to Jason. Karla and Paul also found themselves a 17-year-old girl called Norma. Norma was actually friends with Tammy before she passed away, so she knew Karla and Paul and thought that they were a nice young couple. They took her out shopping, went to movies together, but this time Paul forbid Karla from using Halcyon, since the last two times both Tammy and Leslie stopped breathing. Christmas was right around the corner, as neither Paul nor Karla really liked Christmas. Also, Paul would pull away at the time from his wife because he still kept blaming her for Tammy's death. On the 13th of December, Paul and Karla took Norma out to the Toronto Sky Dome. They went to dinner, where the couple would also order alcohol for Norma, and then they checked into the Royal York Hotel. Karla seemed to have drank a little too much because eventually she passed out, leaving Paul and Norma alone in the room. And Norma liked the couple, she liked being around them since they were nice and friendly. But Norma didn't have any intentions to go all the way with Paul. And once Christmas came around, Paul gave her a lot of presents, like stuffed animals, a gold necklace, a watch, a bracelet. And once the three of them were sitting around, Karla announced that she was off to bed, and she actually went into the guest bedroom to sleep in. Eventually Norma just had enough of Paul trying to get it on with her, so she just laid on the floor to sleep. But when she woke up, she was in the bed next to Paul. So after that incident, Norma visited them once again, but this time she had a boy with her called Brian, and Paul freaked out over it. He demanded that Norma said that she loved Paul, and she had just told him like, look, you are way too old for me, and no, I don't love you. And she told the couple that she wouldn't come over anymore. And this was just too much for Paul. In the past 3 years, he had lost 3 important girls. And once Norma left, he started to beat on Karla and keep on screaming that this was all her fault. He went to Montreal for New Year's Eve, and once he came back, Paul lashed out on Karla with a flashlight, which resulted in her having 2 black eyes. On the 5th of January, Dorothy, Karla's mother, surprised her daughter at work, and once she saw her daughter, Karla confessed that Paul had hit her. So Dorothy told Karla to go home and pack up her things. But once Dorothy and her husband Carl arrived, no one answered the door, so Karla's mother called 911. Dorothy also received a call from Paul, where he handed Karla the phone, who just told Dorothy that everything was fine and that she should just go home. The next day, Dorothy came back for Karla, just to find her daughter in an even worse condition than she was the previous night. So her parents were like, alright, that's enough. You are coming with us, and they had to force Karla to stay with her aunt and uncle. And I believe that's also when Karla started to make comments that Paul had something to do with the death of Tammy. Eventually, the family pursued Karla to go to the hospital, and the doctor who examined Karla actually said that this was the most extreme case of domestic abuse that he had ever witnessed. Paul was arrested and charged with assault with a weapon, but the police didn't even keep him in for the night. In fact, once Paul returned home, he became severely depressed as he washed down some pills with vodka. Paul also kept on calling Karla, telling her how sorry he is and that he needs her, pleading for her to come back, and if she didn't, that he was going to take his own life. His friends tried to console him, but they had also seen Karla, and they asked Paul like, what happened? But at first he said something like, oh, she just fell off a ladder. But of course no one really believed him that story, so he finally confessed that he did beat her. But he also tried to defend himself by saying, well, she isn't so innocent herself. After all, she did kill her own sister. On the 9th of February in 1993, Karla was said to be interviewed by the police regarding the attack on her. At first she didn't want to, but eventually she agreed as long as her aunt was allowed to be present. And throughout the whole interview, Karla just gave one-worded answers, never really going into any detail when asked about her marriage and her life with Paul. So once the officers left, her aunt was like, alright, what's going on here? And Karla just calmly said if she had ever heard about the Scarborough rapist, and if so, well, that's Paul. So her aunt, in complete shock, just asked her niece if he ever killed anyone, to which Karla just nods yes. She also went to confess to her aunt that he was also responsible for the 2 dead girls, Leslie and Kristen. And she also confessed to her aunt that she was involved in those murders and that it was all on tape. So now, after hearing all of this, her aunt's response was just, you need a lawyer. So she got one, and he just told her, look, don't talk to anyone, not your family, not the police, no one, I'm going to handle it. On the 17th of February in 1993, Paul Bernardo was arrested for the Scarborough rape attacks, and I've mentioned earlier that he had given his DNA example willingly. So what happened was that he was never officially ruled out as a suspect, but because there were over 1,300 samples to be tested, the entire process took a lot of time and also a lot of money. But once they arrested Paul, they again took his DNA sample and it turned out to be a match. So the police officers went straight on to interview him, and they also told him from the start, like, look, we know you're the Scarborough rapist, so why don't we talk about Leslie and Kristen's murder? But Paul still denied everything, so he was actually kept in jail for that day of his arrest. Now what is worth mentioning is that Paul's court date was set on the same day that his, well, I'm gonna say father, even though he isn't his real father, Kenneth Bernardo date was. What happened was that Paul's sister Deborah reported him to the police because Kenneth also assaulted Deborah's daughter, just like he did with his own daughter. On the 18th of May 1993, Karla's lawyer got her a plea deal where she would be charged with manslaughter and for her to be out on bail until her trial. So on the 6th of July 1993, Karla Homolka pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Paul's trial was set 1 year later in September 1994, but before that, Paul told his lawyer about the videotapes and that they were all hidden in his ceiling. Upon finding the tapes, Paul's trial was actually postponed to the 18th of May in 1995. And Karla was also in court as it was part of her deal to testify against Paul. She was portrayed as this battered wife that had to go along with everything that Paul wanted. And she even confessed that she dressed up in her dead sister's clothes because Paul would threaten her otherwise. Karla also went on to say how she agreed to let Paul have sex with Tammy and how the whole plan came about leading to her death. And she also went on to tell everything that Paul and her did, but always kind of put it in a way that she wasn't participating in it willingly and that Paul always kind of forced her. But by this point, no one really believed that story because it was clear to almost everyone that Karla was doing it all too gladly for Paul. Paul Bernardo was found guilty of all charges and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. But as of now, he is actually still locked up behind bars. In July of 2005, Karla was released after serving her 12 years. And as far as I'm aware, she moved to Quebec in Canada. So yeah, that's it for today's case, a rather heavy one to close off our well-intense couple crime month. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you liked it, I might consider doing more of that in the future. As always, please let me know in which case you would like to see me cover next. I hope I see you all in my next video. Take care, bye!